Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. I've started a new YouTube presentation series to help people as they're sitting at home and wanting to get insights out of research on supply chain evolution, trying to make it easy, sharing the research, helping people to get past the day-to-day of what is a very different world. Today, I want to talk about the fallacy of supply chain integration. In fact, I've thought about a whole series of fallacies. When I presented this to a group, they said, well, what are the other fallacies? Well, there's the fallacy that the efficient supply chain is the most effective, which it isn't. Supply chains need to be fit for purpose. And then there's all the fallacies around advertising of supposed best practices, which aren't, because they don't translate to balance sheet performance. And then there's the fallacy of the fact that many believe that we have best practices, where I see that we have traditional practices that don't really help us to evolve. So in this world of supply chain, it's very exciting because we're starting to get a lot of innovation at the edge of what I call decision support. Many people have grown up in the traditional world of supply chain planning, which has been very focused on theory of constraints. And we're in the evolution of the platform to expand past a more limited definition of supply chain planning to decision support that has innovation with analytics at the edge. So whether it's platform rationalization, cost to serve, visibility for transportation planning, rules-based ontologies to be able to guide decision support for baseline demand. No matter where we are on the edge, we're starting to see the evolution of planning on the edge. And then this gets to the question of integration, because many times supply chain planning teams are forced to buy software because supposedly greater value happens from buying from a single vendor, and that single vendor has integration. Well, the only thing that's integrated in that kind of purchase is the billing cycle. You get the invoice from the same company, but you don't necessarily get what you need as a stepping stone to drive supply chain excellence. So that's what I want to talk about today, is how do we think about integration versus interoperability and synchronization and harmonization, and how do we drive value? So first of all, who's Lora Cecere? What a horrible picture, huh? I'm kind of this crazy research gal that does quantitative research using a panel of 317,000 LinkedIn followers around the world. I keep my respondents confidential, share all of the information on SlideShare and LinkedIn, and I do webcasts and podcasts and speaking, and I try to help people to understand how do we use new technologies to drive better value. So I'm kind of cooking up ideas on my kitchen table in Pennsylvania and speaking to global supply chain leaders everywhere about the trends. I write for the Supply Chain Leader. While many times the analyst will write for IT, and yes, I've worked for many analyst firms, I get tired of writing and talking to the IT laggard industry. I want to write for the business leaders, for those that are stretching out, asking themselves, how do I do more? Those that are working in team environments, trying to stretch the capabilities of supply chain. That's the audience Lora Cecere writes for. And so let's start with, what is the goal? Many times companies will say to me, this is a supply chain leader from a recent speech, I want to build an end-to-end integrated supply chain. And I say to them, what is end-to-end? And what does integrated mean? And they look at me like I'm the dumbest analyst in the world. Well, you may think I am, but these things, these words need really concrete definition. What is end-to-end? I define end-to-end as from the customer's customer, supplier, supplier. Most companies define end-to-end as the order to cash or procure to pay, a very narrow definition based upon transactional data. And most companies have focused on automating the enterprise, which is okay, but unfortunately, the automation of the enterprise is self-limiting as we become more and more dependent on networks. This is more and more true as we transform the supply chain to be able to have resiliency in the face of COVID-19 disruption. And then I say, well, what does an integrated supply chain mean? And for a person that's new to the space, they're looking at how do I get data from point A to point B? But what they don't realize is that in this world of supply chain, there's a lot of disparate data that's very different. And that data needs to move with context. And so it isn't okay just to connect data. We need to synchronize and harmonize data and really drive interoperability across systems and bidirectional orchestration, which allows us to do what-if analysis, simulation, modeling, to be able to look at price to price, market price, raw material price, bidirectional orchestration of bill of material, rationalization of platforms, rationalization of inventory. All that bidirectional orchestration is not really built by integration. It's built by synchronization, harmonization, and interoperability. And my goal today is for you to have a red flag when anyone says to you, I want to build an end-to-end integrated supply chain. And here's why. Only 4% of companies, when compared to their peer group, are driving improvement while outperforming their peers. Now, outperforming their peers is hard, but driving improvement while outperforming is even harder. Let me explain. I use the analogy of the gym. When you first go to the gym, you drive a lot of improvement because you're out of shape. But as you get more and more in shape, you've got to change techniques. Perhaps you've got to hire a trainer or get a new bike or get a better helmet. Whatever you're doing, you're taking steps to drive performance, and you have to try new techniques. What is happening is most companies try to drive improvement through functional excellence, focused within manufacturing or focused within procurement or focused within distribution, without looking at cross-functional alignment and without clarity on total cost in the balance sheet. Only 29% of companies can easily get to data on cost. So companies will start to drive improvement, but then they'll get stuck and they'll need to look at different techniques and they'll need to constantly evolve through a stepwise impression of driving improvement, stabilizing performance, driving the next level of improvement, stabilizing performance. And the more mature the company is, the more they need to be an innovator to not get stuck on this path. So, yep, like the gym, the guy with the red headband will drive improvement faster, and the guy on the left will struggle to drive improvement. The more fit the supply chain, the harder it is to drive improvement, and the more you've got to push a step change in thinking. Most supply chain progression is about 60% change management, about 30% process, and about 10% technology. The three have to go hand in hand, but the change management issues are the hardest because many times people don't think hard enough about the definitions of the words they use and the need for alignment. So let me back up and tell you a story. I've been an industry analyst now for 2 decades, and I tracked the spending on IT for a decade and a half. And it was 1.7% of revenue on average on information technology. And before I started doing the analysis, I believed that companies had driven improvements at the intersection of operating margin and customer service, and that we were really driving great value in organizations, but I was wrong. I was wrong. In fact, what we find is that most companies are going backwards. And they're going backwards because they're circling, they're pushing functional metrics, or they're improving functions like procurement, which is causing adverse effects in manufacturing, and they're going round and round. They're not able to drive the kind of improvement and sustained improvement that they need. So when we do our research, one of the things we say is, what are good descriptors for the supply chain? Is it controlled? Is it uncontrolled? Is it a mixture of push, pull? Is it aligned, or is it functional silos? But notice that only 1/3 of companies believe the supply chain is working well, but yet they're the same companies that'll say, let's implement best practices and let's look at an end-to-end integrated supply chain. And most are reactive, and they're mostly inside out. They're focused on enterprise data, not on market data. So while companies want to improve, they're following the same path they've done for years. And so they're not able to really embrace the fact that most companies can't readily access total cost to guide their programs. Only 1/3 of companies have supplier development programs and know the location of their second and third tier suppliers, which is really problematic and what's happening in this disruptive era. And only 1 in 2 companies tie S&OP planning to execution. Most companies really work hard on planning, getting ready for the meeting, aligning for the meeting, but then don't tie it to execution and make sure that they close the loop. And only 9% of companies are actively designing supply chains, which amazes me because I was a chemical engineer and I could never get out of engineering school unless I could design a heat exchanger and a distillation column. But yet we're running supply chains that are not holistically designed across source, make, and deliver, and we're not looking at form and function of inventory. And when I say form and function of inventory, I'm saying, what form should inventory be? The higher the demand variability, the more that I have to hold goods as a raw material or a semi-finished good. And the higher the demand volatility, the more I need to use postponement techniques or be able to look at platform rationalization. So only 15% of companies are actively measuring form and function of inventory. And as a result, we got a lot more inventory coming into the COVID disruption than we did the 2007 recession. And that might have helped us actually, because what happened was we weren't ready for the pandemic and we are working off these inventories. But as we work off these inventories, we're going to find ourselves, the water's going to start to get lower and lower, and we're going to start to get big rocks emerging. And part of it is going to be the fact that while we've talked about demand-driven, outside-in, market sensing translation of what people are using, and we've talked about value networks, the connection of suppliers, materials, manufacturers to be able to drive value, what we've really built is the efficient enterprise that is not very effective in driving supply chain excellence. And it starts with the definition of what is an effective supply chain. What is the definition of efficient, which I define as the lowest cost per unit, which is an efficient supply chain cannot be responsive. The responsive supply chain has the shortest cycles, and an agile supply chain has the same cost, quality, and customer service, given the level of demand volatility. So each of those 3 goals requires a different design. And then we measure the effectiveness of those designs by looking at performance. How am I doing against peer group? Looking at improvement. How am I improving my metrics versus year-over-year results? And how resilient is what I'm doing? How much can I absorb shocks and drive the same level of performance despite what's happening in the market? So a supply chain needs to be fit for function. It needs to be designed. People need to be aligned. It requires getting cohesion on metrics. This is part of the problem of why people are not happy with their supply chains. And part of the disconnect comes to this concept of integration. There's this belief that you have an API and you bring things together into smaller components to function as one, and the API basically moves data from one system to the other. But what about context? Let me give you an example. Isn't each a barrel, a pallet, a cup, or a serving unit? What many people say, well, that's a master data issue. Well, no. With tight integration, I have these in spades all over the supply chain because data needs to carry context around what is in each, what is a location. You know, I work a lot with BASF, and I went to their offices in Germany, and they had 300 loading docks. Well, you know, each of those docks has some nomenclature, so context matters. The other thing is that the current concept of decision support happened out of theory of constraints. In 1980s, there was a belief, and it was pushed by Ellie Goldroth, that the supply chain is a system limited by a series of constraints. And what we need to do is model around those constraints. Now, the issue here is there's no management of flow, and there's nothing that really looks at how can we improve this, like multiple ifs to multiple thens and rules, or the translation of policy. There's an awful lot that could be layered on, but what's happened in the last 3 decades is we have built decision support tools on the theory of constraints, ending up with an architecture that looks something like this. Each box represents an optimization technique. Each red arrow represents a workflow, and then we've layered what's called APS, or advanced planning, on top of enterprise resource planning. So it doesn't work so well, right? Because we need to synchronize, and synchronize is the coordination of events to operate in unison. I say, let's think about an orchestra. An orchestra is synchronized, it's not integrated. That is what needs to happen with make, source, and deliver. It needs to be synchronized, not integrated. We need workflows that help us to look at relative rates and changes of flows. And what about harmonization? Harmonization aligns different variants to make the elements identical. An example is calendars. Harmonization needs to go across the supply chain to look at time phase data and align, to look at calendars and periods. We don't have harmonization in the supply chain. Integration is very different as a concept from synchronization and harmonization and interoperability. And without synchronization and harmonization, we can't analyze flow. And the supply chain is a complex nonlinear system with many flows. We've got demand flows. We've got supply flows. We've got information flows. We've got cash flow. And so mapping these flows is an important piece and can't really happen through integration. Today, only 26% of companies state that they're starting to experiment with streaming data. Now, streaming data is through Internet of Things, weather, all data that is moving at a real-time pace. So most companies struggle with where are they going to put real-time data. And this is an example of a workshop that I did where we ideated on what is a demand flow? What is the river of demand that flows through the supply chain? And when you think about demand flows and you think about synchronization and harmonization, you see how narrow the concept of integration is by many supply chain leaders. And in today's culture, you know, because change management is such a major issue, you know, we want to be customer centric, but we can't be without understanding the flows. We want a systemic approach and we want process thinking, but to do that, we have to analyze flows. And we've got to do it across all functions because the organization is not aligned. And unless we work on the metrics and the flows, We can't close these gaps. Sales and operations have the largest gap, followed by manufacturing and procurement, operations and IT, and finance and operations. No wonder the world of the $5 billion company becomes very political very quickly. It's because people talk in circles. They talk about integration. They talk about one number forecasting. And they don't understand the need for synchronization and harmonization and context. So here's the conundrum. We have tightly bound data in the organization versus enabling it to drive flow and to enable it to drive new answers. So let's just step back and say, is this a time for us to think about a better way of doing things? In the COVID-19 world, it's the first time in my lifetime that we won't have a new normal. No. What's going to happen is we're going to have disruption after disruption after disruption after disruption, and the world will get to be very gray. We'll have the hammer and the dance. So what happens is when the rates get really high of COVID-19 virus spread, the hammer will fall, and the states and the municipalities will start to shut down. People will scurry home, their buying patterns will change, and then we start the dance of opening back up and gradually opening until, again, the hammer falls. And we will have this same pattern for the period until we get a vaccine. And so many people say, well, you know, I've heard on TV that a vaccine is going to be 18 to 24 months. And I say, whoa, not so quick. I believe even if we get a vaccine, that it will take us years to be able to vaccinate everyone to make it effective, because vaccine discovery doesn't give us a shot in the arm. To give you an example, at 66, I was signed up for the shingles vaccine, the new shingles vaccine, which is great after you get over the side effects. And I was on a list for 3 years. It's a GlaxoSmithKline product. It was in short supply. I couldn't get it at all. So we're going to have trouble with vaccinations. And until we get herd immunity with vaccinations, we are going to go through constant disruption. And so people need to expect shifts in demand, higher cost, manufacturing outages, supply disruption, logistics outages. Think about this all through the lens of tight integration versus synchronization and harmonization, about functional work versus working together cross-functionally. You know, as we think about those demand shifts of pantry loading, substitution, and economic subsidies, we'll go through these time after time after time with the dance, all of which are disrupting demand and causing shelf issues because we have not reduced demand latency. Demand latency is the time from consumption to the translation of an order. And as a result, we need to focus outside in, look at base level consumption, and try to minimize latency. Tie sales and operations planning to execution, and know where our suppliers are. Track the signals coming in and build supplier development programs and base our planning on actuals, because lead times and cycles will vary greatly as we get through some logistics cycle, and build a planning master database so that when you look at lead times and cycles, you're not really working on the data that was implemented, but real data. And then align the teams against shared metrics. You know, a metric like OEE in manufacturing is going to throw the team out of alignment, whereas a metric like first pass yield or schedule adherence will drive the team in alignment. Focus the functional metrics on reliability, and focus the corporate metrics on value-based metrics of growth, cost, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital, and try to outperform your peer group and align all of the company participants against those metrics. So in short, we've got technology in transition. We've got traditional supply chain thinking. It's functional, it's linear, it's transactional, it's inside out. You kind of throw that away to drive the level of performance that needs to happen. And we've got to think about cross-functional, non-linear, and outside-in processes based upon new forms of analytics that allow us to sense, learn, and act. But to do that, we must throw away the paradigm that most people have of the end-to-end integrated supply chain. The goal is not integration. We need to focus on synchronization and interoperability, reducing cycles, time is of the essence, and build our processes outside in, and be open to the outcome for new forms of analytics like digital twin, flow management from companies like Celonis, and the use of advanced what-if modeling, whether it's Kinaxis or LlamaSoft or OMP. Each of these companies bring some what-if modeling capabilities. So until there's a vaccination, form an operational team and a recovery team. Work on how do you manage flows and reimagine the capabilities. Build the strong supplier development teams. Find out where your second and third tier suppliers are and work on flows. One of the biggest issues is managing inbound transportation. So our manufacturing plants can't run unless they get that inbound transportation. And we can't monitor the inbound unless we know the location. And build better, reimagine what this could look like. Look at new forms of analytics to sense the black holes. And what I say to people is, invite your most knowledgeable supply chain leaders to a conference room and ask them to close their eyes. And then ask them to list the number of black holes in the supply chain. Where could they not get the information they needed in the past week? And make a list. And then look at, where are you in driving performance? Where did you have disruption the prior year? And how many of those issues are driven by the lack of data and the black holes? And then say, well, what data do you have in the organization that might be able to solve those black holes? So for example, I was working with a make-to-order distributor. They really wanted to be customer-centric, and they focused on a survey once a year. And okay, so I do surveys a lot, and I'm like, a survey is so ineffective because it takes a year to develop, it takes 6 months to tab. This company is not really fast. And, it's just not synchronized with the business process. So we brainstormed on the data they had, and they got like 10,000 emails a month from their distributors and their customers. And I'm like, can't we really monitor the words used through sentiment analysis and then tie that into really reimagining what's happening? And that if we see sufficient sentiment, that helps us with trends. So if we see people starting to complain about quality of a certain product, we can quickly map that to be able to look at outcomes. The use of sentiment analysis can cut the time from sensing an outage to understanding what it is by about 80%, because we're able to quickly see what's happening and translate. And then focus locally and improve the supply chain response. I hope that helps. As you work on this yourself and you have next steps, reach out. I'd love to hear from you. But until then, I don't want to find you talking about the integrated end-to-end supply chain. Instead, what I would like to see you do is unlearn to build better and change your goal to say, I want to build an effective value network. Value network is important, not an enterprise, to manage flows from the customer's customer, the supplier's supplier, through harmonizing and synchronizing data. I realize the goal is not integration, but interoperability and bidirectional orchestration. And when you do, you're going to outperform. Thank you. This is Laura. All the best out there, and let me know your thoughts. Until next time.